John Metchie III, future PPR star. We're about to break that down right now on the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. Welcome back, patrons, to another episode of the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Lamarco. Today, we have another one of those great what you need to know about some of these rookie profile players. We're doing John Metchie III to the Texans today. Before we bring in our guest for the show, and at this point on Mondays, he's a mainstay, but before we bring him on, we want to talk quickly. Make sure you're following us across the board. If you're watching us right now, subscribe. Rate, leave a comment on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. Make sure you're checking us out on Razzball Fantasy on TikTok and IG. And finally, make sure you're going to Razzball.com. We're doing fantastic stuff. We just launched our brand new ADP tool. By the way, if you want to see trends, you better go to Razzball.com. Our ADP tool is fantastic. We also have consensus dynasty rankings amongst multiple great sites. But make sure you're also checking out all the other great sports, baseball, hockey, and basketball. Now, without further ado, I'm going to bring in my co-host for today. It's Matthew Jones. You can find him at Draft Examiner on Twitter and at draftexaminer.com. What's up, Matthew?
Hi, Bobby.
Once again, sir, you got me hooked on the show to talk about one of the players you're going to be writing a feature about later for Razzball.com. It's John Metchie III. So, you know the drill. Tell us what you learned. Let's get right into it. John Metchie III to the Texans.
So this is probably my first time talking about a player who was drafted in the Canadian Football League draft. So the BC Lions took him 59th, but I don't think he'll be heading back to Canada. So he is the 8th out of 9 Alabama players that Nick Caserio has chosen, either as a director of player personnel for the Patriots or in Houston. The next pick right after him was Christian Harris. And he was probably drafted a little bit earlier than people were thinking because obviously he hurt his ACL against Georgia in the SEC championship game. So we don't really know the status for the beginning of the season. But at Alabama, I believe he was a 4-star recruit, and he didn't really play that much as a freshman. But as a sophomore, he stepped into a pretty big role when Jalen Waddle got hurt. I think that was in the 5th game of the season, and he ended up having over 900 yards. Then Devonta Smith and Waddle left, and he started opposite Jamison Williams. He basically went into the X role, replacing Smith. And he had a little bit more stable output this past year. He went over 1,000 yards, and I think his output was a lot more consistent on a week-to-week basis. There were a few smaller games, which were typically the games that they played against, smaller programs as well, and they didn't really need to lean on a receiver that much. So I think one of the interesting things about him is that he lined up all over the place and he played a bunch of different roles. So they had him as more of a deep threat as a sophomore. He averaged almost 17 yards per catch. And then this past year, he did a lot more work underneath and, on routes over the middle. So they typically have him doing a lot of things like digs, hitches, slants, overs, things like that. And then that was a little bit of a different role from what he had as a sophomore. He played in the slot a lot as well. I think he had almost 400 snaps in the slot between the last 2 seasons combined. And, Alabama often has a lot of tight formations where they'll move the receivers close to the line and have them, get some different looks for the defense. So probably the main concerns that people have had besides the ACL are just his overall physical and athletic skill set. His arms measured pretty small at the combine. I think he's something like the 22nd percentile among receivers. And we don't really know what his speed is necessarily because obviously he wasn't able to work out. We don't know whether the ACL is going to, impact his explosiveness. But why the Texans drafted him there, he's really quick. He's got nice releases at the line. He uses a hop step a lot. He's good at selling his routes. He can do, some good whip routes and things like that to create separation underneath. And they really tried to get the ball into his hands a lot on screens and little kind of pop passes and things like that to let him run after the catch. So, he can do a bunch of different stuff. And I think that's probably what Nick Caserio was, looking for when they drafted him.
Now, when I was looking at some of his comps, it looks like Russell Gage popped up, Eddie Royal, Randall Cobb. A lot of those guys have your typical, prototypical slot receiver history to them. But what it sounds like you're saying is that he is actually more versatile than just being a slot guy. So do you see him just being in the slot in the beginning of his career and then moving all around later? Or what's your thoughts on him early on?
Well, like I said, he played both inside and outside in college, and I think the reputation he has as not having elite speed or not having good speed is mostly because this past year a lot of his routes were shorter routes, and I don't. That wasn't really the case when he was a sophomore. So I do think he could potentially play a little bit of a flanker. And as for the comparisons, I can kind of see Randall Cobb. I think Randall Cobb makes some sense. I thought maybe Casario might have seen someone like Deion Branch when they looked at him, and basically I think he could be a little bit of an inside and outside guy, but I don't know that he's necessarily like a mismatch when he's playing on the outside, and he might have a little bit of trouble dealing with some physicality and so on because he doesn't have the longest arms. He's not the biggest guy, so you'll see him getting disrupted on the routes a little bit in college when he's going against a more physical corner.
Okay. So it does sound like he might be better suited for the slot in the interim, maybe let his game develop just a little bit. But ironically, that's where the targets will be needed because, of course, Danny Amendola doesn't sound like a big name, but they did lose some guys in the middle of the field with Jordan Akins and Danny Amendola. They also, David Johnson's out the door. And those guys quietly had some decent amount of targets, but really it's Brandon Cooks and everybody else on this offense. So it does sound like he can take over as a number two. So my question is, you have Nico Collins, another young player, Brendan Jordan, and then a veteran like Chris Connolly. Do you think that weaker depth chart means that Metchie could be starter week one, or do you think that he will need time to develop in the league?
Well, because he's rehabbing from the ACL, I don't think he'll be ready at the beginning of the season. They're doing some individual work right now, so they do have him, running some basic routes and stuff during the camp. But I don't think they're going to force him back onto the field, especially because this isn't really a competitive team right now. So, last season they had 3 receivers who went over half of the snaps. Obviously, Brandon Cooks is the lead receiver. Nico Collins played, I believe, 56% or so, and Chris Conley played over half. But Collins and Conley are both basically outside receivers, so I do think the slot is somewhere he could basically contribute as soon as he's ready. Now, when that is, I mean, I think he's probably might end up on the PUP list or something and be coming back, week 7 or 8 of the season. So after that, I think he could start putting up some numbers because there's not really a lot of competition for his specific skill set in the offense. And I do think that although Pep Hamilton is coming in, I think his reputation as being a really aggressive coordinator is a little bit exaggerated because you look at the 3 seasons he was in Indianapolis with Andrew Luck. In 2014, Luck had an absurd number of deep throws. It was something like he had over 70 throws down the field. But if you look at 2013 and 2015, which was the year he got hurt, neither of those seasons were particularly, downfield passing games. They were both, a lot of shorter throws and things like that. So I think with Davis Mills, you also have a guy who didn't take a lot of shots downfield last year, and I don't necessarily know that they're going to, emphasize having him be much more aggressive. I think they're going to probably try and bring him along with a little bit easier throws and a chance to kind of get in a rhythm. So I think, Metchie could be one of the guys he leans on down the line this year if he's, whenever he's ready to come back onto the field. And then next year, I could imagine him being a pretty big part of the offense as well.
Now, when you're looking at some of the Alabama receivers to succeed in the NFL, you're looking at the Waddles, the Jerry Jeudy, Calvin Ridley, Amari Cooper. Does he profile anything like those guys, or is he a completely different type of player?
I wouldn't say he's that close to any of those guys. Typically Alabama guys are a little bit more explosive and a little bit bigger. I mean, I don't think he's a below average athlete or anything, but, he doesn't have any of the rare physical tools of like a Waddle or a Cooper or, anyone, Jamison Williams. So, he's definitely going to be a complimentary receiver to me. I don't necessarily know that he's going to, be getting off the line as easily against, big guys and beating man coverages consistently, but he did show the ability to beat man in college just from his releases. And some of the games that he was producing were against some, big time cornerbacks. So he, Roger McCreary and other, high draft picks. So he's not purely a guy who finds the soft spots in zone coverage, but he does rely a lot on his route running skills and changing speeds and releasing to create separation.
Now, when I was looking into, I wanted to check out Pep Hamilton. And the one thing I will say is, even though he might not be as aggressive, he was more aggressive in how much he threw the ball versus what the Texans did last year. Now, we could sit here and say Davis Mills was a rookie. They didn't really know what he could do yet, so they were conservative. I do agree with that. But we could expect a little more pass volume under Pep Hamilton. So I did want to take a look at the number 2 receiver, those 3 seasons essentially with Andrew Luck, and also his one season. He was an associate head coach of Hugh Jackson in Cleveland. But I wanted to take a look at some of the number 2 receivers and rookies under him. And the rookies were Dante Moncrief, Philip Dorsett, and Corey Coleman. In the 3 seasons that he was kind of either really involved with play calling or the OC, none of those rookie wide receivers really had a productive season. Coleman was actually the best at wide receiver 66. For number 2 receivers, because I personally think Brandon Cooks is probably the best option for this year and next year most likely. The number 2 receivers in the Pep Hamilton offense, wide receiver 25, wide receiver 54, wide receiver 49, and of course, wide receiver 66. So there wasn't really that much success outside of his number 1, which is T.Y. Hilton. And I think Brandon Cooks, different podcast, could be really good. So let's dive into maybe his Dynasty Outlook, because I do believe in redraft he's going outside the top 200. I think from the sounds of it, you think his injury is going to maybe give him a slower start, maybe even start the year on the pup. So let's focus on Dynasty. Currently, today he's going 16th overall, right ahead of Rachaad White, the running back for the Bucks, Alex Pierce, who we talked about recently, and Wan'Dale Robinson. What are your thoughts about his kind of long-term success? Would you take him maybe over an Alex Pierce or a Wan'Dale Robinson?
I think he's going to have more volume than Pierce, and as basically, if he got onto the field at the beginning of the week, at the beginning of the season, week 1, I would put him ahead of these other second-round receivers, just because I think, the slot, he's going to get a lot of work. It's going to be a pretty reliable volume. We just don't really know what that situation is. So, maybe later on in this season, when he comes back, you can consider, looking at him in some PPR leagues and stuff. I don't necessarily know where I draft him right now, because you basically have to stash him on the roster for a few weeks, I think. But, in 2023, they still have Cooks and Collins under contract beyond this year. Obviously, they just signed Cooks to an extension for 2 years. And pretty much all of that's guaranteed. Collins was just a 3rd-round pick last year, so he's got 3 more years on his deal. But basically, Conley, Philip Dorsett, both of those guys are on the last year of their contracts. I believe they re-signed Conley to a 1-year deal. And Dorsett they signed in December, I believe. So I think this first year, you can afford to bring him along slowly, because, you're basically a rebuilding team. You don't necessarily know that you have a true franchise quarterback. The team has not given clear statements consistently that Davis Mills is even the starting quarterback this year. So they basically want him to win the job. Obviously, I think we all probably expect him to be the starter. Yeah. But the fact that they didn't totally commit to him, makes me think that they're not making long-term plans around Davis Mills necessarily. So I think we'll see him this year. We'll see how it goes. And then, next season, if they have a high draft pick, they're probably going to be looking at, the top quarterbacks in the next year's class. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, what do you expect from this kid? He's not even a top, 2-round pick at quarterback, Davis Mills. He comes into a situation where an unproven young tight end, unproven skill position group behind Brandon Cooks, running backs that are in their late 20s, early 30s, all across the board. And it's how are you truly going to evaluate this kid? I hope that John Metchie can help. But yeah, that was my quick thought. But go ahead, finish up.
Yeah, it's really hard to judge him so far. He's been a little bit inconsistent with his ball placement, some footwork things. And so we haven't totally seen a consistent game from Davis Mills. I feel like he'll miss throws that he should be making, and then he'll make some impressive throws later on. But, the Texans also couldn't establish the run at all last year. They kept reshuffling the offensive line around. They were ranked last in yards per carry. So I know they wanted to emphasize establishing the run game a little bit more. I think that's something Hamilton could help them with. They drafted Kenyon Green in the first round to play left guard. So now Titus Howard can move out to right tackle. I think that's going to bring some stability to the offensive line. So if they can get the run game going, I think that's going to help a lot. Hamilton likes to pull the guards a lot. He likes to have like the tight ends crack, pursuers on the backside. So you saw that a lot with like Dwayne Allen when he's in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
So if you can get the run game going well, I think it's going to help out Mills a lot and just generally having, more stable protection. And I mean, last year, I think Mills his average, air yards for his targets for something like 4.1, which is pretty low. But that's something where I think Metchie might add a little bit of explosiveness to the offense just because he's really good at picking up yards after the catch. He had a ton of catches on screens and other kind of manufactured touches to try and get him the ball in space. He's agile. I think a PFF had him with something like 6.7 yards after the catch on average. So, it doesn't necessarily need to be a downfield passing attack, but it needs to, be able to generate some big plays. And I think if you've got the play action as a viable option, then you can do some crosses and things like that, and you can maybe, get some chunk plays from that kind of passing game.
Well, that's it, folks. I mean, listen, at this point, I think Marlon Mack coming in and Dameon Pierce, Dameon Pierce coming in should help that ground game and absolutely do that. But that's all we got for today, folks. This was John Metchie III going to the Texans. What you need to know for your rookie drafts. Once again, thank you to Matthew Jones. You can follow Matthew Jones on Twitter at Draft Examiner, but also check out his work at draftexaminer.com and also on Razzball.com, folks. He's got great articles posting on the site as well. Make sure you're subscribing to the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel, and make sure you subscribe to the IG and TikTok accounts as well. I'm your host, Bobby LaMarco. Over there is Matthew Jones. We're out of here.